Tonight, picture a great stone church standing in the dark of an English river valley, long before the sun has any intention of rising. It is a little after 2 in the morning, sometime in the middle of the 13th century, and there is frost on the grass of the cloister garth. The valley is asleep in the way that valleys were once allowed to be asleep, which is to say completely. With no light anywhere except the low red eye of a banked fire in a gatehouse hearth and the pale gray suggestion of the river moving between its banks. And then, somewhere high up in the tower, a rope is pulled and a bell begins to speak. It is not an urgent bell. It is a slow, deliberate, patient bell, and it goes on for some time, because it is not there to alarm anybody. It is there to wake 60 or 70 men who are lying fully dressed on straw mattresses in a long, unheated room above the chapter house, and who have been asleep for perhaps 4 hours, and who will now get up in the cold, in the dark, and walk down a worn stone staircase directly into the church to sing in the middle of the night. They will do this tonight. They did it last night. They will do it tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night of their lives. And their predecessors did it in this same building for 100 years before them. And their successors will do it for 200 years after them. And the whole enormous machine of the Abbey, with its kitchens and its brewhouse and its bakehouse and its infirmary and its mills and its barns and its fish ponds and its scriptorium full of quiet men bent over skins, exists in order to make that one small act possible 8 times a day, every day, without a break, forever. That is what we are going to spend tonight inside. Not a battle, not a siege, not a king, not a scandal. Just the ordinary working life of a large medieval English monastery. From the first bell before dawn to the last one at nightfall, and outward through the kitchens and the brewhouse and the scriptorium and the infirmary and the fields, and through all the men who kept it running, most of whom never wrote a single word down, and whose names are gone. It is one of the calmest stories in English history, and it is a story with almost no drama in it at all, which is exactly why it is such a good place to fall asleep. So settle now into whatever stillness you have made for yourself tonight. Let the lamp grow dim, or let it go out altogether. Let your shoulders come down, away from your ears, because they have almost certainly crept up there again without asking you. Let your hands go loose. Let the small weight of the day slip down off you, one quiet inch at a time, the way a heavy coat slides off the back of a chair when nobody is watching it. There is nothing in this story that needs anything from you. You do not need to remember any of it. You do not need to follow the dates, and there will be a great many dates, all of them spoken slowly, and none of them important. If you drift off in the middle of the night office and wake up somewhere in the brewhouse, that is not a problem. That is the entire point, and you have not missed anything that will not still be here tomorrow. There is no thread to hold. You can let go of it. My only job tonight is to talk quietly for a long time about men in wool and stone corridors, and the smell of yeast and beeswax and damp lime plaster until you are no longer listening. If you find this useful, and only if you truly enjoy what I do here, you might leave a like on the video or subscribe, though honestly, the best time to do that is tomorrow, in daylight, once you have slept. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments below. It helps other sleepless people find their way here, and there is something oddly comforting about scrolling through a list of strangers awake at 3 in the morning in Manchester and Melbourne and Manitoba, all of them being read to about the same abbey. Now then, the Abbey. It is worth saying at the very start what a monastery actually was, because the word is softened over the centuries into something vague and picturesque. And it was not vague, and it was certainly not picturesque to the people inside it. A great English abbey was three things at once, layered on top of each other like the courses of its own walls. It was, first, a house of prayer, a place whose entire declared purpose was the continuous performance of a cycle of psalms and readings and chants called the divine office, day and night, in strict order, in perpetuity. It was, second, a household, in the old sense of that word, meaning a self-contained settlement of anywhere from 30 to 500 people who all had to be fed, clothed, washed, warmed, doctored, buried, and kept from getting under one another's feet in an age when none of those things happened by themselves. And it was, third, a very large agricultural and industrial business, with tenants and rents and flocks and mills and quarries and salt pans and lawsuits and account rolls, run by a small number of extremely competent administrators who spent most of their working lives thinking about grain prices and drainage. All three of those things were happening in the same set of buildings at the same time. The prayer was the reason, but the bread and the beer and the wool and the parchment were the means, and the men who made the bread and the beer were just as much part of the machine as the men singing in the choir. In fact, one of the quiet pleasures of looking closely at monastic life is discovering how much of it was, in the plainest sense, work. Not mystical work. Not symbolic work. Actual work, of the sort that leaves your hands cracked in winter. Someone had to malt the barley. Someone had to scald the milk pails. Someone had to go out in the sleet to check that the fish pond sluice had not silted up again, and someone had to write down, in a neat hand, exactly how many eels had been taken out of it, because the Abbey's auditors were coming, and the Abbey's auditors were not sentimental men. So let us go slowly. We will start long before there was anything on this site at all, because that is the honest way to tell it, and because the ramp into the story is where the sleep lives. Then we will build the place, stone by stone, and walk into it, and take up our position in the dark at the foot of the night stair, and go round the whole circle of the hours with the community, one office at a time, until the same bell rings again at the far end of the day and the candles go out. And then we will go sideways into the kitchen, and the bakehouse, and the brewhouse, and the herb garden, and the infirmary, and the great cool room where books were made out of animal skin and soot and crushed stone, and out through the gate to the granges where the lay brothers lived, and we will finish where all of these places finish, which is in grass. Because they are all in grass now. Mostly that is the ending, and I am telling it to you at the beginning so that there is no suspense in it anywhere, and nothing waiting to jump out at you in an hour and a half. Before there was an abbey in that valley, there was no valley in the story at all, and before there were monks in England, there were no monks anywhere, and it is worth going back that far, because the shape of the whole later thing was set very early and then hardly changed for 1,000 years. For most of human history, the ordinary religious life of a settled people happened where the people already were. There were temples and towns and shrines by springs and priests who lived among their neighbors and ate at their tables. The idea that a person might deliberately withdraw from ordinary society, not for a season, but permanently, and live under a fixed daily rule with others who had done the same, is a comparatively late invention, and it began a very long way from the wet green fields of England. It began in the dry country south and east of the Mediterranean in the 3rd and 4th centuries, when individual men and then individual women began walking out of the towns of Egypt and Syria and Palestine into the desert margins to live alone in caves and abandoned tombs and rough huts of reed and mud. They went out for reasons that were partly religious and partly, if we are honest about it, a matter of temperament. Some of them wanted silence. Some of them wanted to escape the demands of family property. Some of them found the busy, negotiated, compromised life of a late Roman provincial town unbearable and preferred a rock. Whatever the reason, they went. And then, because human beings cannot help themselves, other people followed them out into the desert to ask them questions, and settled nearby, and before very long the solitaries had accidentally invented a community. That is the first thing to understand about monasticism, and it stays true for the whole of the next 1,000 years. It is an attempt at solitude that keeps turning into a village. Out of those desert settlements came the first written rules, the first attempts to say in plain sentences how a group of people who have renounced ordinary life should divide their day. How long to pray, how long to work, what to eat and how often, and in what order to sit down. Whether to own a spare cloak, what to do about the brother who is always late. Those early rules traveled north and west along the same roads as everything else in the late Roman world, into Italy and Gaul and across the sea to Ireland, and each region bent them to its own climate and temperament. The Irish version was famously severe and famously mobile, full of long fasts and cold water and monks who could not stop getting into boats. The Gallic version was more settled, and in Italy, in the 6th century, in the hills between Rome and Naples, a man whose name has come down to us as Benedict wrote a rule for a monastery that was, above everything else, moderate. That moderation is why it won. The rule that Benedict wrote is not a long document. You could read the whole of it in an afternoon and still have most of the afternoon left. It has about 70 short chapters, and its tone is that of a practical man who has watched a number of enthusiastic projects collapse and would like this one to survive. It assumes the men in it will be tired and irritable and inclined to argue about food. It sets out a daily timetable of prayer, reading, and manual labor balanced so that no part of it swallows the others. It insists that the community elect its own head, that this head listen to the whole community before deciding anything important, and that he take particular advice from the youngest members, on the grounds that God often reveals what is right to the least experienced person in the room, which is either profound theology or extremely shrewd management, and possibly both. It legislates for the sick, the old, and the young with real tenderness, and it lets the ones who need more food have more food. It allows wine with a small sigh about the fact that it is allowing wine. It tells the head of the house not to be excitable or suspicious, because a man who is those things is never at rest. It is, in short, a document written by somebody who understood that the enemy of a long project is not weakness, but exhaustion, and that the only way to keep a group of people doing something difficult every single day for 50 years is to make the daily portion of it bearable. That single insight, more than any doctrine, is what built the Abbey in our valley. Meanwhile, on the western edge of the world, these islands were going through their own noisy centuries. Roman Britain had come apart in the 5th century, and out of the wreck came a patchwork of small kingdoms in which Christianity survived strongly in the West and in Ireland, and had to be reintroduced in the East. It came back from two directions at once. From the north and west came the Irish tradition, moving through Iona and down into Northumbria, austere and missionary and fond of remote islands. From the south came a party sent from Rome at the very end of the 6th century, landing in Kent, careful and organized and Roman in its instincts. For a while the two traditions ran alongside each other in the same kingdoms, disagreeing politely and then less politely about a number of matters, the most famous of which was how to calculate the date of Easter. That sounds like a small thing to modern ears. It was not a small thing. If the king and the queen keep different calendars, then one of them is feasting while the other is still fasting, and the whole court has to decide which kitchen it belongs to, which is a problem that tends to age badly. The argument was settled at a gathering in Northumbria in the middle of the 7th century in favor of the Roman calculation, and from that point onward the English church looked south for its patterns. And the pattern it found, increasingly, was the rule of Benedict. It did not arrive all at once, and for a long time it was mixed with other rules and local customs. Early English monasteries were often family affairs founded by royal kin, sometimes housing both men and women in separate quarters under a single head, frequently an abbess of high birth who was, in every practical sense, a landowner and a political figure of the first rank. They accumulated books and relics in workshops. They produced the great illuminated gospel books whose pages still look impossible. They produced scholars whose letters were read across Europe. And then, from the end of the 8th century, they were exposed, one after another, to the arrival of ships from the north. The raids that began on the coastal and island houses were, from a purely practical point of view, aimed at exactly the right targets. A monastery in that period was a defenseless building containing portable wealth, a good stock of food, and no soldiers. Over the following century, and then over the following 2 centuries of warfare and settlement, monastic life in the eastern and northern parts of England largely stopped. Not everywhere and not permanently, but enough that by the time the kings of Wessex had fought their way to a kind of unity in the 10th century, the older houses were gone or reduced to a few clerics living on the rents of a ruined estate. What happened next is one of the quieter turning points in English history, and it is the reason our Abbey exists. In the middle of the 10th century, a small group of English churchmen with strong royal backing set out to rebuild monastic life from the ground up deliberately on the Benedictine model, using texts and customs imported from Reformed houses in Flanders and northern France. They wrote an agreed English customary, a document which took the bare bones of the rule and filled it out with the details of exactly how the offices were to be sung, when the bells were to be rung, how the community was to process, and what was to happen on every day of the year. They refounded the old sites and endowed them with land, and they made the Abbey for the first time. A standard institution of the English kingdom rather than an occasional aristocratic hobby. From that moment, the thing we are looking at tonight has a continuous existence, and it is possible to stand in a valley and say, with reasonable confidence, that there has been an unbroken cycle of chanting on this ground since before the conquest. Then, in the autumn of 1066, the kingdom changed hands, and within a generation almost every major church in England was pulled down and rebuilt bigger. This is not an exaggeration. The Norman aristocracy that took over England had a building habit that amounted almost to a compulsion, and the new abbots and bishops brought over from Normandy looked at the old Saxon churches, which were often small, tall, narrow, and perfectly serviceable, and decided that they were provincial. Within about 60 years of the conquest, nearly all of the great English cathedral and abbey churches had been demolished and replaced with vast round arched buildings of a scale that had not been seen in these islands since the Romans left. Massive cylindrical piers the width of a small room. Walls of enormous thickness built as two dressed stone skins with rubble and mortar poured between them. Nave arcades marching away into the dark for what felt like half a mile. The men who commissioned them were not being modest, and they were not building for the local congregation, because in a monastery there was hardly any local congregation. They were building a machine for singing in, and they were building an argument in stone about who was now in charge. For the monks who lived through the change, it must have been an odd few decades, because the offices had to continue while the building came down around them. Communities put up temporary wooden choirs or moved into a completed eastern arm while the nave was still open to the sky, and went on singing the night office under canvas in the rain. The building accounts and chronicles of the period are full of these arrangements, described with a flatness that suggests everybody found it normal. The 12th century that followed is the great age of the English monastery, and it is when the map fills up. In the space of about 100 years, the number of religious houses in England multiplied several times over. Part of that was simple wealth and population growth. Part of it was fashion, in the sense that founding a monastery became the standard thing for a great landowner to do with a portion of an estate, in the way that later centuries built almshouses or hospitals or endowed schools. And part of it was a genuine wave of reforming enthusiasm coming out of France, which produced a whole cluster of new orders, each of which believed that the existing monasteries had grown too comfortable, too rich, too involved with the world, and too fond of elaborate ceremonial. The most important of these for the English landscape were the white monks, the Cistercians, who arrived in the north in the 1120s and 30s and changed everything about how an abbey sat in its countryside. Their program was a return to the letter of the rule, plain churches without towers or colored glass or carved capitals, no painted decoration, no gold, no bells rung in elaborate patterns, undyed wool habits, which is where the white monks got their name, because ordinary undyed sheep's wool is a pale grayish cream rather than the black of the older houses. Sites deliberately chosen in remote valleys away from towns, and, crucially, no dependence on rents from a scatter of tenanted villages. The Cistercians intended to live from the direct farming of their own land, which meant they needed a labor force, and which produced the single most interesting social invention in the whole monastic system, the lay brother, who we will come to properly later tonight because he deserves a long, slow section of his own. Alongside the white monks came other varieties, and the ordinary English county could contain a remarkable range of them. The old black monks in their ancient wealthy houses, often in or beside a town, with a cathedral or a great market at the gate. The white monks out in the dales running enormous flocks, houses of regular canons who lived under a rule but also served parishes and hospitals, and who were often planted in awkward, useful places like bridgeheads and river crossings. Houses of nuns, generally much poorer and much smaller than the male houses, chronically underendowed, and doing the same round of offices with a fraction of the income. Small cells and priories of 2 or 3 men, dependent on a distant mother house, running a manor and a chapel and not much else. And from the 13th century, the friars, who were not monks at all in the technical sense, since they were not tied to one house and went about preaching in the towns, and who represent an entirely different answer to the same question. So when we talk about a great medieval English abbey, we are talking about the top end of a very wide range. Most religious houses in England were small. The picture in most people's heads of soaring arcades and 100 voices and a library of chained books describes perhaps the largest 30 or 40 houses in the country. The typical house had somewhere between a dozen and 30 religious in it, with a modest church, a cloister you could cross in 20 paces, and a permanent, quiet anxiety about money. The great houses, though, were something else again. A first-rank abbey could hold 60 to 100 monks at its peak, with a lay community and servants that pushed the resident population past 400, sitting on estates spread across 3 or 4 counties, with the abbot summoned to the king's parliaments and a legal department that never stopped working. Our abbey tonight, the one in the river valley with the frost on the cloister grass, is one of those. Let us give it a shape. Picture a wide, flat-bottomed valley with steep, wooded sides, somewhere in the north of England, with a clear river coming down it from the moors. The house was founded in the middle of the 12th century by a great magnate who had a nervous conscience and a spare valley. And the first party of monks arrived in autumn, which was a foolish season to arrive, and spent the first winter in timber huts roofed with turf, eating what the founder's steward sent up the valley and cutting alder. That first winter is recorded in a single line in the house's later chronicle, written 150 years afterwards by a monk who is rather enjoying the drama of it. And it is one of the very few sentences in the whole book with any feeling in it. Within 20 years, there was a stone church. Within 50, there was a bigger stone church, because the first one had been outgrown, which is a fact that tells you more about the 12th century than any amount of theology. Within 150 years, the eastern arm had been extended again to hold a great many more altars, and the whole precinct covered something like 30 acres inside its wall, with an inner court of dressed stone buildings around the cloister and an outer court that looked and smelled and sounded exactly like a working farmyard, because that is what it was. To reach it, you came up the valley on a track that the Abbey maintained, through fields the Abbey owned, past a mill the Abbey had built. And you crossed the river on a bridge the Abbey had paid for and would go on paying for, grumbling gently, for the next 3 centuries. The first thing you met was the gatehouse. And the gatehouse is where we should stop for a moment, because it is the seam between 2 worlds, and it is the reason the whole arrangement held together. The gatehouse of a great abbey was a substantial building in its own right, often 2 stories with a vaulted passage through the middle, a large arch for carts, and a small one beside it for people on foot, and a chapel over the top or beside it where travelers who were not going any further could hear a service. It was staffed permanently. The porter was one of the few members of the community whose job the rule describes in detail, and the description is charming and slightly weary. He should be a sensible older man, the text says, who knows how to take a message and give an answer, and whose age prevents him from wandering off. He is to have a room by the gate so that anyone arriving finds somebody there rather than an empty yard. In practice, at a large house, the porter had assistants and a lodge with a fire, a book for recording arrivals, and a great deal of discretion, because he was the man who decided in the first instance whether a person at the gate was a guest, a pilgrim, a beggar, a supplier, a tenant with a complaint, or a problem. Just inside the gate, the world was still very much the world. The outer court of a monastery was a working yard, and if you had been set down in one at 10 in the morning with no explanation, you would probably have guessed you were on the home farm of a very large estate, which again is exactly what you were on. There were stables and cart sheds and a smithy with its own hearth and the flat ringing noise that goes with it. There were granaries on Staddle stones and a great barn whose roof timbers were the most expensive single object in the county. There were wood piles and turf stacks and a stone-lined pit for slaking lime. There were carpenters, masons in a temporary lodge if any building was going on, which at a great house was more or less permanently tanners. A plumber who worked lead for the roofs and the water pipes, a tiler, a shoemaker, and a small permanent population of paid servants who lived either in the outer court or in the village outside the gate, and who were not monks and had no intention of becoming monks. It is easy to forget how many of them there were. At a large abbey, the paid lay servants could outnumber the monks by 3 or 4 to 1. The picture of a monastery as 60 men doing everything themselves is a picture of a small, poor, or very strict house, or of a house in its first idealistic decades. By the 14th century, the great houses were employing cooks, bakers, brewers, laundresses, gardeners, shepherds, plowmen, carters, and a considerable clerical staff, and the monks were increasingly doing what senior people in any large organization end up doing, which is administration and ceremony. Beyond the outer court, through a second inner gate, the ground changed. This was where the noise stopped. The inner precinct held the church and the cloister and the buildings that ranged around it. And the closer you came to the cloister, the quieter and cleaner and more regulated everything became, until at the center you reached a square of grass that almost nobody was allowed to walk on. But before we go in, we should talk about water, because water is the secret subject of monastic building, and almost nobody notices it. Every decision about where to put an abbey was a decision about water first and everything else second. The community needed drinking water that was clean, which usually meant a spring on higher ground, piped down in lead or in hollowed elm trunks over a distance that could run to a mile or more. It needed a supply of running water to flush the latrines, which meant a stream that could be diverted through a stone-lined channel running directly beneath the long building where the latrines were, at a fall steep enough to keep it moving and gentle enough not to undercut the foundations. It needed water for the kitchen and the brewhouse and the bakehouse and the laundry, water for the fish ponds, water with enough head to turn a mill wheel and preferably 2 or 3 mill wheels, and water for the tannery and the fulling of cloth, both of which needed to be downstream of everything else for reasons that become obvious the moment you stand near either. And it needed all of this arranged in the correct order along the fall of the valley, so that the clean uses came first and the filthy ones last, which is a piece of sanitary engineering that the medieval religious houses understood perfectly well, and which their towns often did not manage for another 500 years. So a great abbey sat in its valley in the middle of an invisible system of leats and culverts and sluices and settling tanks, most of it underground, all of it needing maintenance. Somebody had to clear the intake grating after every storm. Somebody had to lift the flagstones over the drain when it blocked, which it did, and deal with what was underneath. which is a job that has never once in human history been done by a volunteer. When you look at a ruined abbey today and see the stumps of walls and mown grass, you are seeing the least interesting layer of it. Underneath the grass, the whole plumbing system is usually still there, and archaeologists who dig it find the channels still lined and still falling at the correct gradient, doing nothing. In the dark, patiently, for 500 years. Now the plan itself. The remarkable thing about monastic architecture in Western Europe is how standardized it became. If you learned your way around one great abbey, you could walk into another 400 miles away in a different country in the dark and find the latrine without asking. The church lay along the north side of the arrangement, usually, so that its bulk did not shade the cloister and steal the sun. South of it lay the cloister itself, a square courtyard with a covered walk on all four sides, roofed and often glazed in later centuries, opening through arcades onto a small square of grass in the middle called the garth. And around that square, in a fixed and sensible order, lay everything else. On the east side, running south from the church, came the sacristy where the vessels and vestments were kept, then a passage, then the chapter house, which was the community's meeting room and the second most important space in the whole complex. Above that whole eastern range, at first floor level, ran the dormitory, a single long room where the community slept, connected at its northern end by a flight of steps directly into the church, so that the monks could come down in the night without going outdoors. That flight of steps is the night stair, and in the ruins of English abbeys, it is one of the few features that still makes visitors go quiet, because the treads are worn into deep hollows, and the hollows were made by feet going down them in the dark, twice a night, for 300 years. At the far southern end of the dormitory range, over the drain, sat the latrine block. A long room with a row of seats and stone partitions, each with its own window and the stream running underneath. The south side of the cloister, farthest from the church, held the warming house, the refectory, and the kitchen. The warming house is worth a sentence on its own because it is the most human room in the building. It was the only room in the whole enclosure, apart from the kitchen and the infirmary, where a fire was allowed, and between the beginning of November and Easter it was lit, and the monks were permitted to come in and stand at it between offices. A fire in a cold building is not a small thing. There are house customaries that legislate for how long a brother may stay, and how he should not stand directly in front of the hearth, blocking it from everyone else, which tells you exactly what was happening. The west side of the cloister, finally, held the cellarer's range, the great stores of food and drink, and, in Cistercian houses, the quarters of the lay brothers, who had their own dormitory and their own refectory and their own entrance into the west end of the church, and who lived, in effect, a parallel life in the same building. So that is the container. Now let us fill it with time, because time is what a monastery actually produced, and the shape of the monastic day is the single most distinctive thing about the whole institution. The day was divided by 8 services, called the offices, or the hours. Their names in order are vigils, which was also called matins, or the night office, then lauds, then prime, terci, sext, none, vespers, and compline. The last 4 of those names are simply the Latin numbers 3, 6, 9, and in the case of compline, the word for completion, and they refer to the hours of the day counted from sunrise in the old Roman fashion. That old reckoning matters because it means the monastic hours were not fixed clock hours at all. The day from sunrise to sunset was divided into 12 equal parts, and so was the night, which means that in June an English daylight hour was much longer than an hour of darkness, and in December the reverse, and the whole timetable breathed in and out with the seasons like a sleeping animal. Nobody had a clock in the modern sense until the very end of the period. And even then, it was a mechanism in a tower with no face on it that simply released a hammer onto a bell. Time was told by the sun, by candles marked in bands, by water dropping through a vessel, and by an extraordinary amount of accumulated practical judgment in the head of one man, the sacrist, whose job it was to wake up before everybody else and decide that it was now. He is one of my favorite figures in the whole system, this man. Somewhere in a great stone building full of sleeping people, one middle-aged monk lies awake in the dark, listening to the wind, working out from the position of a particular star through a particular window, or from how far a candle is burned, or from nothing more than a long, trained instinct, whether it is time. If he called the community too early, they would stand in the choir at the end of the night office with an hour of darkness still to go, which the customaries treat as a real inconvenience. If he called too late, the office would run into daylight, and the whole rest of the day would be pushed backwards. There are accounts of sacrists using a length of knotted cord and the stars, and of houses where the man simply woke at the right time out of habit year after year, the way some people still wake 3 minutes before their alarm. And when he was sure, he went and pulled the rope. Vigils, the night office, came in the small hours, somewhere around 2 in winter and rather later in summer, and it was the longest of the 8 by a wide margin. This is the office we heard at the start of tonight. The community rose in the unlit dormitory, put on their day shoes, went down the night stair with a lantern or two showing the way, and took their places in the choir stalls. In an unheated stone church in February, this was, by any measure, a genuinely hard thing to do, and the monastic writers do not pretend otherwise. There are complaints about frozen ink and numb hands, and legislation about how many extra garments may be worn in choir in winter, and a beautiful, tired instruction in more than one customary that if a brother falls asleep during the night office, he is to be woken gently, and if he does it repeatedly, he is to be given a lantern to hold and made to stand, which is one of the few disciplinary measures in history that is also a practical solution. The night office itself was long. In the Benedictine scheme, the whole book of Psalms was recited across each week, and the largest share of that fell here, in the dark, when nobody could read anything anyway, which is why the Psalter was learned by heart. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Every choir monk knew the entire Psalter, all 150 psalms in Latin from memory, because he had sung them through once a week, every week, since he was a boy of 15 in the novitiate, and he would go on singing them until he could not stand up. That is somewhere over 7,000 recitations in a long life. The words were not information to these men. They were the surface of the mind, the way a familiar road is the surface of the mind for someone who has walked it every day for 40 years and no longer notices individual trees. Between the Psalms came readings, long ones at vigils, taken from Scripture in a fixed annual cycle and from commentaries and the lives of the saints, read aloud from a lectern by a brother appointed for the week. And the chanting itself was the plain song the whole system was built on, single unaccompanied melodic lines sung in unison, without harmony in the earlier centuries, moving in a narrow range at a walking pace with no fixed beat. If you have heard it, you know how it works on the body. It is designed not to excite. It is designed to be sustainable for 2 hours by tired men. And the effect of 60 voices doing it in a stone building with a long reverberation is not really musical in the way we usually use that word. It is more like weather. When vigils ended, there was, in most houses and most seasons, a gap. In summer, when the night was short, they went more or less straight on into lauds at first light and then back to bed for a short second sleep. In winter, when the night was long, the gap between vigils and lauds could be an hour or more, and here the customaries do something rather lovely. They tell the brothers to use the interval for private reading and study, and they specify that a lantern should be provided. And they also record, with what I can only describe as a straight face, that some brothers use the interval to sleep, and that this is permitted, since the rule says that those who need more sleep should have it. So there is your medieval abbey in the black middle of a January night. A stone room with a lantern at each end and a scattering of men in wool, some of them reading, some of them praying, and some of them, quite legally, asleep on a bench with a book open on their knees. Lauds came at daybreak, and it is the office of the returning light, shorter than vigils, full of psalms about morning and creation. It was sung as the windows began to gray, and in a great church you would have been able to see the color come back into the painted walls and the glass over the course of it, which is not an accident of scheduling. Then prime, the first hour at about 6, and after prime the community went out of the church and into the chapter house, and the working day began. The chapter house was a fine room, often the finest after the church itself, sometimes polygonal, with a single slender pillar in the middle holding up a fan of vaulting, with stone benches running around the wall in tiers so that everybody could see everybody else. The community assembled there every morning of every day. And the meeting took its name from the fact that it opened with a chapter of the rule read aloud. That reading went straight through the whole text several times a year, so that no member of the house could ever claim not to have heard the relevant sentence recently. After the rule came the necrology, the list of the dead for that day, names of former members of the house and of its benefactors. Going back to the foundation, read out year after year, so that a man who had died in the 1180s was still being named aloud in the same building 300 years later. Then came the practical business, and this is where the abbey ran itself. The abbot or the prior in his absence gave out the work of the day. Officials reported. Building projects were discussed. Legal matters were laid before the community, because in law the community as a body owned the property, not the abbot personally, and important transactions needed the assembled house to consent and to have its seal attached. Letters were read. A brother being sent to a distant grange or to the order's general chapter or to the university was formally sent. And then, at the end, came the part that everybody who has ever worked anywhere will recognize with a small internal sigh, which was the correction of faults. In its ideal form, a brother who had broken one of the house's countless small rules would rise, come to the middle of the floor, state what he had done, and accept whatever penance the superior gave, which was usually something like extra psalms, or eating on the floor of the refectory instead of at the table, or being last in every procession for a week. In its less ideal form, other brothers were permitted to raise the faults of their neighbors, and human nature being what it is, the customaries very quickly filled up with careful rules about that. You may not accuse out of ill feeling. You may not raise a matter you have not seen yourself. You may not answer back at the time. If you have a grievance against another brother, you must not carry it about with you. The whole apparatus is a wonderfully clear-eyed acknowledgment that 60 men who cannot leave, cannot marry, cannot own anything, and see exactly the same faces every single day for 40 years are going to get on one another's nerves in ways that require formal management. Chapter over. The day opened out. What happened next depended enormously on who you were, because by the 13th century, a great abbey contained several quite different working lives running in parallel under one roof. The bulk of the community, the choir monks, went to the cloister to read, or to the scriptorium to write, or to whatever obedience they held. The officers went to their departments. The novices went to their master for instruction. The lay brothers, if the house had them, had already been gone for hours. Terce was sung at about 9, and on Sundays and feasts the community's principal mass followed it, the high mass of the day, sung with all the ceremony the house allowed itself, which in an old black monk abbey meant incense and processions and colored vestments and a great deal of it, and in an early Cistercian house meant a fraction of that. Sext came at about noon, and after sext, in summer, came the main meal. None came in the middle of the afternoon, and after none, in winter, came the only meal. Vespers came in the early evening as the light went, sung by candlelight in the darker months, and after vespers there was a light supper if the season allowed one. And Compline closed the day. Compline is the loveliest of the offices and the one that has survived best outside the cloister, because it is short and it is unmistakably a lullaby for adults. It has always been the same handful of psalms sung by heart, ending with a hymn asking for protection through the darkness, and then the community went in procession from the choir. Were sprinkled with holy water at the door by the superior, and went up the night stair to bed in complete silence. From that moment, the great silence began, and no one spoke at all until after the following morning's chapter, except in genuine emergency. The house closed itself down like a hand closing. Around all of this, the year turned, and the timetable turned with it. From Easter to the middle of September, the house ran on the summer horarium, with a longer working day, an earlier rising, 2 meals, and a siesta after the midday meal in the hottest months, which the rule provides for and which English houses kept, even though the English summer rarely justifies it. From the middle of September until Lent, the house ran on the winter horarium with a longer night. 1 meal a day taken in the middle of the afternoon, and more time in the cloister with books, because there was less that could usefully be done outside. And in Lent, the whole thing tightened again. The single meal moved to the evening. Every monk was given a book from the library at the start of Lent, 1 book to be read straight through during the season, and the librarian noted who had which. And at the following year's distribution, each man had to give an account of whether he had actually read it, which is the earliest and most effective book club in English history. Over the top of this ordinary rhythm lay the calendar of feasts, and it was dense. There were the great festivals, Christmas and Easter and Pentecost, each with its own long vigil and its own extra ceremonies and its own better food. There were the feast of the apostles, of the great early saints, of the local saint whose relics the house possessed, which was the biggest day in that particular abbey's year and drew crowds to the gate. There were the days of the house's own founders and benefactors, when their souls were prayed for by name, which was, after all, the entire commercial basis of the arrangement, and we should be honest about that. A great deal of the land that fed these communities had been given in exchange for perpetual prayer, and the Abbey side of the contract was to remember precisely and forever a list of dead landowners. And there were the ordinary weekdays, the great majority of the year, when nothing in particular happened, and the same 8 offices came round in the same order, and the bell rang, and the men got up. Let us go out now into the cloister itself, because the cloister was where a choir monk spent most of his waking life, and it is the room that people misunderstand most often. It looks, in a ruin, like a courtyard. It looks like an outdoor space, a garden, somewhere pleasant to stroll. It was not really any of those things. The cloister was the working hall of the community, and the covered walks around its 4 sides were furnished, occupied, and busy in a quiet way from the end of chapter until vespers. The north walk, the one against the church wall, got whatever sun there was, and that is where the reading and writing happened, in a row of little partitioned stalls called carrels built against the wall between the buttresses, each just big enough for one man, a sloped desk and a window. In the greatest houses these were wooden, paneled, with a door that could be shut, and in later centuries they were sometimes glazed. A monk was allotted his carrel, and it stayed his. He kept his book in it. In the great heat of a July afternoon it would be the coolest place in the county, and in the middle of January, with a wind coming off the moor, the cloister walk was so cold that the customaries permit brothers to leave for the warming house at intervals. And there is one lovely piece of evidence in a book from a northern house, where the copying stops abruptly in a fine hand and resumes in a shakier one, and a note in the margin observes that the ink had frozen. Against the wall near the entrance to the refectory stood the lavatorium, which is the washing place, a long stone trough, or sometimes a beautiful circular pavilion projecting into the garth, with a lead pipe feeding a row of taps and a stone shelf. The community washed their hands here before every meal, in order of seniority, and there were towels on a roller which were changed twice a week, and the officer responsible for changing them is named in the customaries, because if you do not name the officer responsible for the towels, there will be no towels. Beside it there was usually a cupboard in the wall for combs, since the tonsure had to be maintained and the whole house was shaved and clipped together, in a routine that happened perhaps every 3 weeks in the cloister. In silence, by brothers appointed to do it, in an order of seniority. That is one of those details that suddenly makes the whole thing real. 60 men sitting on benches in a stone corridor, taking it in turns to shave one another's heads 6 or 7 times a year for their entire adult lives. The garth in the middle, the square of grass, was kept mown and was mostly not walked on, though there is evidence that in some houses it held a well or a tree, and the plainest houses simply kept it as grass and let the light down into the walks. Underneath it there was often a cemetery, or beside it there certainly was, because the community buried its own in a plot on the eastern side without coffins in the earlier centuries, in the habit, with no stone and no name. And around this square, in the covered walks, the community read, wrote, taught the novices, took the weekly foot washing, held its processions, sat out the intervals between offices, and observed above everything else silence now. Silence, this is the part that outsiders find hardest to imagine and the part that the sources are richest on, and it is worth being precise. Because the popular idea that medieval monks never spoke is not quite right and the truth is more interesting. The rule does not require perpetual silence. It requires restraint in speech, treats idle talk and laughter as things to be discouraged, and imposes strict silence at certain times. Above all, at night and in certain places, particularly the refectory, the church, the dormitory, and the cloister. What happened over the following centuries is that the customaries tightened this steadily until, in the strictest houses, ordinary conversation had nowhere left to happen at all except in one or two designated rooms at one or two designated times. Usually the parlor, which is simply the room where you were allowed to talk, and which is where the word comes from. And into that vacuum came one of the most remarkable and least known creations of the medieval mind, which is the monastic sign language. Several English houses have left us their lists. They are practical documents, sometimes a page or two, sometimes with well over 100 signs, and they are almost entirely concerned with objects and daily needs. Because that is what you need to communicate when you cannot speak. There is a sign for bread made by joining thumbs and forefingers into a round shape since bread was baked in rounds. There is a sign for fish, a flat hand moved from side to side like a tail. There is a sign for milk, unmistakable and slightly comic, and one for honey, in which you touch the tongue with a finger, and one for mustard, in which you hold your nose. There are signs for every garment and every tool and every book of the Psalter. There is a sign for the abbot and for the sacrist and for a secular person from outside, which in one list is made by drawing a finger across the brow to suggest a hat, since the world outside wore hats. There is a sign for wine and a sign for the better wine, which tells you something. And the lists usually come with a stern preface saying that the signs are not to be used for chatter, and that a brother who makes more signs than are strictly necessary is worse than one who simply spoke, which strongly implies that within about a fortnight of inventing the system, the brothers were gossiping in it fluently, and somebody had to write a memo. That, for me, is the moment the whole institution becomes recognizably human. Silence also did something else, and here I think the sources are describing a real effect and not just an ideal. In a house where speech is rare, sound becomes enormous. The bell is not a signal, it is an event. The particular scrape of the refectory door, the pattern of the abbot's shoes on the tiles, the noise of the lead gutters after rain, the wind in the great open west window, the single cough at the far end of the choir, all of these acquire a weight they cannot possibly have in an ordinary noisy building. And a community that lives like this for decades develops an almost uncanny coordination, moving through processions and meals and offices in a body, with everybody knowing exactly where to stand and when to bow and which foot to lead with, without a word being said, because the whole thing has been drilled into them since they were 15. Visitors from the outside world remarked on it constantly, not on the piety, on the quietness of the machinery. Now the books, because a great abbey was, among all its other functions, a factory for making books by hand, and the process is so slow and so tactile that it is nearly ideal for the small hours. Start with the material. A medieval English book was written on parchment, which is skin, usually sheep or calf, and the making of it began in a yard well away from the cloister, downwind, for excellent reasons. The skin was washed, then soaked for days or weeks in a pit of water and lime, which loosened the hair and the flesh. Then it was hauled out and stretched over a curved wooden beam and scraped with a broad curved knife, hair side first, then flesh side, until it was clean. Then it was lashed with cords to a wooden frame and tightened. And while it was wet and under tension, it was scraped again and again, thinner and thinner, and paired with a half-moon blade, and rubbed with pumice and chalk, and left to dry stretched, so that the fibers set in a taut sheet rather than shrinking back into leather. That is the whole difference between parchment and leather. Incidentally, not tanning. Tension, a skin dried under tension becomes a writing surface, and a skin dried loose becomes leather, and the two crafts sat in the same yard doing almost opposite things. The finished sheet was cut down and folded, and the folded sheets were nested into gatherings, and the gatherings were pricked along their margins with an awl and ruled with a hard point or, later, with lead, so that every page of the finished book had a faint, invisible skeleton on it before a single word went down. And it took a lot of animals. A large service book could consume the skins of a small flock. A great Bible in 2 enormous volumes of the kind a wealthy house commissioned to be read from in the refectory could take the skins of several hundred. That fact alone explains why books were inventoried, chained, and left in wills, and why the loss of one was treated as a serious matter rather than an inconvenience. Ink was made from oak galls, those hard brown spheres that grow on oak twigs where a small wasp has laid an egg, crushed and steeped in rainwater or in wine, then mixed with iron salts, which turned the pale liquid a deep blue-black on contact with air, and thickened with gum from a tree to keep it sitting on the surface. Iron gall ink bites slightly into the parchment as it dries, which is why it is so hard to remove and why medieval writing survives so well, and also why some of it eats through the page after 700 years, which is one of the small ironies of the craft. Pens were the flight feathers of large birds, cut to a point and slit up the middle with a knife and blunted constantly, which is why every scribe worked with a knife in his left hand throughout, held against the page to steady it, and used every few lines to recut the nib. Every picture you have ever seen of a medieval scribe shows him holding a knife, and it is not decorative. Mistakes were scraped out with the same knife, and the spot burnished flat again. For color, the workshop ground its own, red from an earth pigment, or from powdered lead heated in air, blue from azurite, or, for something worth showing off, from lapis lazuli, ground and washed through a paste to separate the pure blue from the gray rock, and imported at a cost that made it more expensive by weight than most metals. Green from copper corroded over vinegar fumes, white from lead, yellow from a mineral or from a plant lake, and gold, applied not as paint but as beaten leaf, laid onto a raised cushion of gesso and burnished with a tooth set in a handle until it took light like metal, which it is, because it is. The scribes worked in the north cloister walk in most houses, or in a dedicated room where the house was wealthy enough, and the work was done standing or sitting at a sloped desk, holding the pen in one hand and the knife in the other, in silence, for as long as the light held. There was no artificial light worth speaking of, because a naked flame near a stack of parchment and a pot of pigment is a bad idea, so the working day was the daylight day, and in an English December that is a short day indeed. The output was correspondingly slow. A practiced scribe copying a plain text might manage 2 or 3 pages in a day. A great decorated book was the work of years and several hands, and the hands can usually be told apart by anybody who spends a week looking. The scribes knew perfectly well how hard it was, and they left notes about it in the margins and in the colophons at the end. They complain about the cold, about the dark, about the parchment being greasy, about the ink being thin. They ask the reader to pray for them. They note that only 3 fingers write, but the whole body labors, which is a sentiment that has aged extremely well. One writes that he has finished and now wants a drink. Another draws a small face in the margin next to a passage he evidently found tedious. These are the least holy and most likable sentences in the whole surviving corpus. Overseeing all of it was an officer called the armarius, or precentor, who was in charge of the books and also of the singing, which sounds like an odd combination until you remember that the chant books were the books that mattered most and that both jobs consisted of knowing exactly what came next. He kept the book cupboard, a great armored press in the cloister wall near the church door. And later, as collections grew, a proper library room. He noted loans. He arranged the annual Lenten distribution. He organized the copying program and decided what the house needed. And what did the house have? A great English abbey by the 14th century might hold a few hundred volumes, and the very greatest held over 1,000. Which in a world where a single volume represented a flock of sheep and 2 years of a man's working life, is a staggering accumulation of capital. The contents were not what people expect. Yes, there were Bibles and psalters and service books and the writings of the church fathers in quantity. But there were also the Latin classics, grammars, works on medicine and herbs, on law, on estate management, on arithmetic and a calendar, chronicles, and the house's own cartulary, which was the great register of every charter and grant and boundary it possessed, and which was, in strictly practical terms, the most valuable book in the building, because it was the evidence. Now the food and the rooms it came through, because feeding a large community every day for 4 centuries, without refrigeration, without a shop, and under a set of religious restrictions that ruled out a great deal of what was available, is a genuinely impressive piece of organization, and almost none of the men who did it are named anywhere. The officer at the center of it was the cellarer. If the abbot was the head of the house and the prior was its discipline, the cellarer was its stomach and its purse. And the rule describes him with unusual warmth, saying he should be sober, not greedy, not arrogant, not a delayer, not wasteful, and that he should give the brothers their allowance without any air of superiority, and that if he has nothing to give, he should at least give a kind word. The rule then adds, in a line that ought to be carved over the door of every purchasing department in the world, that he is to regard all the goods of the monastery as though they were the sacred vessels of the altar, and consider nothing negligible. In practice, the cellarer at a great house was a senior administrator with clerks, keys, a great range of stores along the west side of the cloister, an account roll, and a permanent low-level war with the weather. He bought and sold. He set the amounts. He ran the granaries and the fish stores and the salt, and he was the man who knew in March exactly how many weeks of grain were left and whether they would reach the harvest, which in a bad year was not a rhetorical question. The kitchen sat at the southwest corner of the cloister, between the refectory and the cellarer's range, and in the great houses it was a spectacular building in its own right, sometimes square with a great vaulted roof rising to a central louvre, with enormous fireplaces set into the corners so that the whole structure was a kind of stone chimney with cooking going on inside it. Some of these kitchens survive, and they are extraordinary spaces, big enough to lose a cart in, blackened at the top, with a scale that only makes sense when you work out the number of mouths. Cooking was done over open fires and in cauldrons hung on adjustable pothooks, in shallow pans on trivets, and in bread ovens fired and raked out. There was very little that we would call an oven for anything else. Meat, where meat was allowed, was boiled far more often than roasted, because boiling feeds more people from less fuel and produces a broth as a byproduct. And because a spit needs a person to turn it. In the strict Benedictine scheme, the choir monks cooked their own food in a weekly rota, each pair of brothers taking a week and being formally released at the end of it with a small ceremony, and in the small and early houses this was really done. By the later Middle Ages in a great abbey, the cooking was done by paid lay cooks and their staff. And the monk called the kitchener supervised rather than stirred, and the monks came to the table like anyone else. What they ate depended on the century, the wealth of the house, the order, and the day of the week, and any general statement about it is going to be wrong somewhere. But the frame is clear enough. The rule allows 2 cooked dishes at the main meal, so that a brother who cannot eat one can eat the other, plus, when available, a third dish of fresh vegetables or fruit. It allows a generous pound weight of bread a day, and says explicitly that if the day's work has been heavy, the superior may add to it. It forbids the flesh of 4-footed animals to all but the sick and the weak. And it allows a measured amount of wine daily, while noting rather wistfully that the ancients thought wine was not for monks at all, and concluding that since we cannot persuade the monks of our own day of this, we should at least agree not to drink to excess. The 2 cooked dishes in an English house were, in practice, pottage and something. Pottage is the great forgotten staple of the entire medieval world, and it deserves better than it gets. It is a thick boiled dish made in quantity of grain or pulses with vegetables and herbs, seasoned with salt and whatever fat was permitted, cooked all morning in a great pot and ladled out. Peas and beans with a backbone of it, dried and stored by the quarter, along with barley and oats. Onions, leeks, garlic, cabbage, worts, parsnips. And the endless green things from the garden went in as they came into season. In a wealthy house on an ordinary day, the something might be eggs in a sauce, or cheese, or fish, or a dish of milk thickened with grain, or a pie. In a poor house on an ordinary day, it might be a second, thinner pottage. When the community went in to eat, it went in procession, washing at the lavatorium, and stood at the tables until the blessing, and then sat in order of seniority along both sides of the long room, with the abbot and any guests at a raised table across the end. And then, while they ate, one brother stood at a stone pulpit set into the wall, reached by a narrow stair inside the thickness of that wall, and read aloud to them, for the entire meal, every day, for life. That pulpit survives in a number of English ruins, and it is one of the most evocative features in any of them. The reader read from Scripture, from the Fathers, from a saint's life, from a chronicle, in a plain voice, at a pace slow enough to follow while chewing. The rule of silence was absolute at table, so anything you needed was requested with the signs. Which is precisely why the sign lists are so full of food words. And the reader, who could not eat while he was reading, was given his own meal afterwards, which the customaries specify carefully, along with a drink beforehand, so that his voice would hold, and in some houses a small extra portion has compensation for having had to do it, which is the most English arrangement imaginable. Bread had its own building and its own officer. The bakehouse stood out in the outer court, well away from the timber roofs of the cloister, because a bread oven is a controlled fire that is lit before dawn and burns hard, and every settlement that ever built one built it somewhere it could not take the rest of the place with it. The oven was a domed chamber of brick or stone with a single mouth, fired with faggots of brushwood until the whole dome was scorching and the soot had burned white off the crown, which was how the baker knew it was ready, since there was no other way to judge it. Then the fire was raked out, the floor swept and mopped with a wet cloth on a pole, and the loaves went in on a long peel. And the mouth was sealed with a stone and clay. The heat stored in the mass of the dome did the baking, falling steadily over the following hours, which is why the great households baked in a strict order, the finest white bread first while the oven was fiercest, then the coarser loaves, then pastry, then the things that wanted a slow heat, and at the very end, in the last warm hours. They put in things simply to dry them. Nothing was wasted, including temperature. The grain came from the Abbey's own mills, and the mills came from the Abbey's own water. Milling was one of the most reliably profitable things a landowner could own, because the tenants of the manor were generally obliged to grind their corn at the Lord's mill and pay a proportion of it, a duty that produced more small, bitter disputes across medieval England than almost any other. The Abbey mill had a stone-lined leat bringing water off the river a quarter of a mile upstream at a level, a pond to store the head overnight, a wheel, a set of gears turning the wooden shaft up to the stones, and a miller who was one of the more resented figures in the local landscape. The flour came back in sacks and was sifted through cloths of varying fineness, and that sifting, more than anything else, decided your social position at table. The finest white flour made the whitest bread and went to the abbot's table and to important guests. The middling made the loaves of the community, the coarsest, with much of the bran left in, made the bread that went out at the gate to the poor, which was, by every measure a modern nutritionist would apply, the best bread in the entire Abbey. On the fixed weekly rhythm, certain days were meatless throughout the church, and in a monastery the flesh of 4-footed animals was in theory excluded altogether, which pushed fish to the center of the diet. And so the Abbey built ponds. A great house might have a chain of 3 or 4, dug and puddled with clay, fed from the leat, each with a sluice, arranged so that the fish could be moved between them by age and size, with a stew pond nearest the kitchen holding fish ready to be taken. They held brame, roach, perch, pike for the high table, and above all eels, which were abundant, easy to trap, and used as a unit of rent across the whole of eastern England, so that manors paid their dues in thousands of eels a year. Beyond fresh water there was the sea, and the sea meant salt and smoke and barrels. Herring came inland by the cartload, salted in barrels or smoked to a hard brown state that would keep for months and needed long soaking. Dried cod, stiff as a board, came from the northern fisheries, and a coastal house or one on a navigable river could get fresh fish in season and would boast about it. The vegetable side of the diet came from the gardens, and there were several. There was a great kitchen garden worked by servants, growing the pottage vegetables in quantity, with beds raised and dug over and manured, and hurdles against the wind. There was an orchard, apples and pears above all, providing fruit for the table and the raw material for cider in the southern and western houses. There was a herb garden by the infirmary, which we will come to shortly. And there were the fields beyond, which supplied the grain and the peas and the beans in bulk. The community's own share in this labor varied enormously by order and by century. The rule is emphatic that idleness is the enemy of the soul, and that the brothers should therefore be occupied at fixed times in manual labor, and the early Cistercians took that with complete seriousness and went out to the harvest as a body, Abbot included, sleeping in temporary shelters during the busiest weeks. In the older and richer black monk houses, the manual labor of the choir monks had, by the 13th century, quietly become something closer to gardening, and by the 15th it had in many places become almost nominal, replaced by reading, writing, and the sheer volume of administration a great estate generated. Reformers wrote about this decline at length. They had a point, but it is also true that a man who spends 6 hours a day singing and 3 hours managing 400 tenants has not exactly been idle. Then there is the question of how much, and here the surviving account rolls, let us be unusually precise, and the answer surprises people. The daily allowance at a well-endowed later medieval English abbey was generous, 1.5 pounds or 2 pounds of bread, a substantial measure of ale, pottage, and a dish or two beyond it. On feast days, extras called pittances, which were originally small additional portions funded by a specific endowment left for the purpose, so that a benefactor might leave a rent to provide the community with a better dish on the anniversary of his death forever. Pittances multiplied over the centuries until in some houses there was one on most days of the year, and a special officer, the pittancer, existed purely to administer them, and the ban on 4-footed meat developed its own famous workaround, which is that the ban applied to the refectory, and so a separate room, the misericord, was built where meat could lawfully be eaten by brothers taking their turn, and in many houses a majority of the community was in the misericord on any given day, while a small remnant kept the letter of the rule next door. The order's own visitors and inspectors grumbled about this arrangement for 200 years without much effect, which is a habit that tends to age badly, and it remains one of the most human episodes in the entire history of institutional rulemaking. Which brings us to the Brewhouse, and the Brewhouse is my favorite building in the whole precinct, partly because it is where the smell was, and partly because the numbers involved are so large that people assume they have misread them. Everybody in a medieval English monastery drank ale every day in quantity. The standard allowance in the account rolls of the great houses runs to something like 1 gallon a day for each member of the community, which sounds like a scandal until you understand what the ale actually was. Most of it was small beer, the weak second or third running of the mash, low in strength, slightly sour, thick with dissolved grain, closer in character to a thin liquid bread than to anything you would order now. It was food. It was hydration. It was safe, because it had been boiled in the making. And it was drunk by everybody at every meal. In a country where the alternative was river water, and where nobody yet knew why river water was a bad idea, but everybody had noticed that it was. Making it was a continuous industrial operation, and at a large abbey the brewhouse ran alongside the bakehouse in the outer court, sharing its fuel supply and often its water and sometimes its staff, since the two crafts are cousins. It began with malting. Barley was steeped in a stone cistern of water for a couple of days until the grain swelled and began to wake up. Then it was spread out on a broad flat floor, a malting floor, in a layer a few inches deep, and left to sprout, and turned with a wooden shovel every few hours, day and night, for a week or more to keep it from matting together and overheating. That turning is one of the great unrecorded labors of the medieval world. Somebody walked up and down a cold stone floor in the middle of the night with a shovel in a room smelling of wet grain, moving barley from one place to another so that a thing invisible to him could happen at the right speed. When the shoots had grown to the right length, judged by eye and by chewing a grain, the malt was carried to the kiln and dried over a low fire on a floor of perforated tiles or woven haircloth, which stopped the germination and fixed the sugars. The fuel used in that kiln decided the flavor of everything that followed. Wood gave one taste, straw another, and in the coal districts later a smoky one that people either liked or complained about bitterly. The dried malt was then ground coarsely, not to flour, and stored, and at that point it would keep, which is the entire point of malting. Brewing day started very early. The coarse malt went into a great wooden tun, the mash tun, and hot water was run onto it, hot but not boiling, and the mixture was stirred with a long paddle and left to stand for a couple of hours while the starch turned to sugar. The sweet liquid was drawn off through a bed of straw laid over the outlet, which acted as a filter, and this first strong running was the best ale of the house, destined for the abbot's table and for guests and for feast days. Then the same grain was mashed again with fresh hot water for the second running, which was the ordinary ale of the community, and then a third time for the small beer that the servants and the poor at the gate and everybody else drank all day long. Nothing was thrown away until the very end, when the spent grain went out to the cattle, which is why every brewhouse in history has had a byre somewhere near it. Then the liquid was boiled in a great lead or copper vessel, cooled in shallow open troughs, which was the slowest and most anxious part of the whole process, because a warm, sweet liquid sitting open to the air can go wrong in 100 ways. And then run into casks with the yeast from the previous brew, which was kept and treasured and passed on, since nobody understood what it was, but everybody understood that you did not lose it. For most of the medieval period, English ale contained no hops. It was flavored, if at all, with a mixture of herbs, and it did not keep. Ale went sour within a few days in summer, which is why the brewhouse worked more or less continuously, brewing every few days all year round, in a rhythm as fixed as the offices themselves. Hopped beer arrived from the Low Countries in the later Middle Ages and changed everything, because hops preserve, and preserved beer can be brewed in larger batches, stored, and moved. The English resisted the innovation with the enthusiasm they usually reserve for foreign improvements to things they already have, and then adopted it completely. In the great houses, the brewer was a paid layman with a monk supervising, and the scale is worth stating plainly. The surviving accounts of some large abbeys' record brewing runs measured in dozens of quarters of malt at a time, producing thousands of gallons in a year, and the brewhouse and bakehouse together were frequently the largest consumers of fuel in the entire precinct, ahead of the kitchen and far ahead of the warming house. To keep them going, the abbey needed woodland, managed properly, coppiced on a rotation so that cut stools threw up new poles for the next cycle. And so a decision made in a brewhouse about how much ale the community drinks turns into a decision about how many acres of woodland must be cut this winter, which turns into a court case about common rights in the wood, which is recorded in a roll. Which survives, and which is how we know any of this. Everything in a monastery is connected to everything else, and the connection usually runs through either water or fuel. East of the cloister, beyond the end of the dormitory range, across a small court and usually connected by a covered passage, stood the infirmary, and it was in many ways a second monastery bolted onto the side of the first. It had its own hall, its own chapel, its own kitchen, its own garden, and its own officer, the infirmary, and it operated under a relaxed version of every rule in the house. Because the rule of Benedict is unambiguous on this point and says that care of the sick is to come before and above everything else, and that the sick are to be served as though they were being served in person by the whole community. The infirmary hall in the earlier centuries was a long, aisled room like a small church, with beds down each side and an altar at the east end, so that a man too ill to walk to the choir could still hear the office from where he lay, which was, for a person who had structured his entire existence around that sound, probably the single most comforting arrangement possible. Later, as houses grew more comfortable, the great hall was subdivided into small private chambers with fireplaces, and by the 15th century, the infirmary of a wealthy abbey looked less like a ward and more like a set of lodgings. Who was in it? 3 groups, mostly the genuinely sick, with the ordinary catalogue of medieval illness. The old, who once they could no longer keep the full round of offices, were quietly moved across and allowed a longer sleep, meat, a fire, and as much of the day as they wanted, and who might live there for 15 or 20 years, and, on a strict rota, everybody else, because of the practice of seasonal bloodletting. This deserves a proper explanation, because it is one of the strangest and most systematic features of monastic life, and it is almost entirely forgotten. Medieval medicine was built on the theory of the 4 humors, the idea that health is a balance of 4 fluids in the body and that illness is an excess of one of them. The obvious remedy for an excess was removal, and the standard method of removal was to open a vein and take a measured amount of blood. In the monasteries, this was not reserved for the ill. It was preventative, and it was scheduled, and every choir monk in the house went through it several times a year in small groups, 4 or 5 at a time, in strict rotation, so that the community was never short-handed in choir. The group being bled was called the Seine, and the days that followed were, by long custom, a holiday. This is the part that always makes people smile. A brother who had been bled was excused the night office, allowed to sleep in, given meat and better food, permitted to walk in the garden, permitted to talk, allowed a fire, and expected to do nothing whatsoever for 3 or 4 days. The customaries specify the meals in loving detail. There are houses where the Seine brothers were sent out to a country manor belonging to the Abbey for a week of what can only be described as a rest cure. So the effect of the whole arrangement, whatever its medical merits, which were nil, was that every member of a strictly enclosed community with no holidays received several times a year. A short compulsory holiday with better food, an excuse from the hardest part of the timetable, and permission to speak freely with a small group of companions. Whether anybody in the 12th century consciously designed it that way, I have no idea. But it is an extraordinarily effective way to run a workforce that can never resign. The infirmary's own craft was herbal, and his garden was the most closely tended ground in the precinct. It was laid out in small raised beds, each with one plant in it, so that nothing could be confused with anything else, with paths between wide enough to kneel on. What grew there is well recorded because the plant lists were copied from house to house for centuries. Sage, which was believed to be so good for you that there was a Latin tag asking why a man should die who had sage in his garden, to which the honest answer is that he dies anyway. Rue, wormwood, fennel, hyssop, rosemary, mint, savory, cumin, lovage, and the great standby comfrey, whose thick mucilaginous root was made into a paste for setting over broken bones, and which is still called knitbone in parts of England, poppy for pain, henbane and mandrake in careful hands for the same. Betony, which was held to be good for so many complaints that one surviving list runs to nearly 50 of them and reads like an inventory of medieval anxiety. Roses for the making of syrups and waters, lilies for salves, and rows of onions and garlic, which have more genuine antibacterial merit than most of the rest of the pharmacopoeia combined. The infomera dried these in bunches under the roof, distilled some of them in a small still, and made up his ointments in a stone mortar, and the whole room smelled the way old herbals smell when you open them, dusty and green and slightly bitter. Beyond herbs, what could actually be done? Bones could be set, and were competently, wounds could be cleaned and dressed, sometimes with wine or honey, both of which genuinely help. Dislocations could be reduced. Cataracts were couched, which is to say the clouded lens was pushed out of the way with a needle, a procedure both terrifying and sometimes effective. Teeth were pulled, fractures were splinted. Beyond that, the honest answer is that medieval medicine could offer comfort, warmth, good food, rest, clean bedding, and the constant presence of other people, and that, in a great many illnesses, those 5 things are most of what any medicine could offer before the 20th century anyway. The infirmary of a rich abbey was, by the standards of its age, a very good place to be ill in, which is precisely why so many laymen paid handsomely to be allowed to retire into one. And when the infirmary could do no more, the house had a procedure for that too, and it is one of the gentlest things in the whole of medieval culture. When a brother was clearly dying, a board was struck or a particular bell rung in a particular pattern, and every member of the community, wherever they were and whatever they were doing, stopped and came. There are customaries which state that a brother in the middle of the fields should drop his tool, and that the community in choir should break off, and that no one is to hang back. They came into the infirmary and stood or knelt around the bed, and they sang, and it went on singing, in shifts, for as long as it took, so that the last thing a monk heard in this world was the same sound he had woken to in the dark every night for 50 years, made by the same voices. He was laid at the very end on a piece of sackcloth strewn with ashes on the floor, which sounds harsh and was in fact an old and deliberate symbol of returning to the ground, and the community continued. When he died, the bell rang out over the valley in the pattern that told the countryside a monk had gone, and the tenants in the fields would have looked up and known. The body was washed by the brothers, dressed in the habit, and carried into the church, where it lay while the psalms went on around it without interruption. He was buried within a day or so in the monks' cemetery east of the chapter house, without a coffin in the earlier centuries, wrapped in the habit, sometimes with a small lead or wax disc of absolution laid on the chest, in a grave dug by his own community. No stone with his name on it for an ordinary brother. No inscription. Nothing to mark which patch of grass. And then, on the anniversary, his name went into the list that was read out every morning in chapter, and it stayed there, being read aloud once a year for as long as the house stood, which for many of these men means his name was spoken in that room by people who had never met him for 250 years after he died. The abbots and the great benefactors got tombs, of course, in the church with effigies and inscriptions, and some of them are still there, worn smooth. But the ordinary brothers went into the ground under the grass between the chapter house and the wall. And when archaeologists open those cemeteries, they find them laid out in tidy rows in strict order, hundreds of men. And the bones tell their own version of the story. They tell us these men were on average slightly taller and better nourished than the surrounding lay population, that they lived longer, and that a striking number of them show the joint wear of heavy work in youth followed by decades of comparative ease, which is exactly what you would expect from farmers' sons who entered a rich house at 15. They show a good deal of arthritis. They show a high rate of a particular kind of bone change associated with a very rich diet, especially in the later centuries and especially in the graves nearest the high altar, which is not a subtle finding, and which archaeologists report with visible enjoyment. And they show, in some houses, healed injuries set well, straight, by somebody who knew what they were doing. Let us take a step back from the deathbed now and look at the men themselves, because I have been describing a machine and it was operated by people who had lives before they came, and who came for a wide range of reasons, not all of them holy. In the earliest centuries, a great many entered as children given by their families as oblates, a practice which sounds shocking now and which was completely normal then, and which produced men who had literally never known anything else, who had learned to read from the Psalter at 7, and who could not remember a time before the bell. That practice faded from the 12th century onward and was eventually abandoned, and from then on entry was an adult decision, generally made somewhere between 15 and 20. The reasons were mixed. Genuine vocation, certainly, and there is no need to be cynical about that, since a large number of these men clearly meant it. But also security in a world with none. Also education, since the cloister was one of the very few routes to literacy, and the universities were full of monks by the 14th century. Also the ordinary logic of family land, which could not be divided forever, so that a third or fourth son of a comfortable family might go to the Abbey the way another went to the law. And also, for some simple temperament, the fact that a certain kind of person is happiest inside a fixed and predictable order, and always has been. What happened next was a year of testing. The rule is careful about this. A newcomer at the gate is not to be admitted easily. He is to be kept waiting for several days to see whether he persists. Then he is taken into the guest quarters, then to the novices, where he lives under a master, learning the Psalter, the customs, the signs, the order of processions, and the enormous body of unwritten practice that made a community work. The whole rule was read to him 3 times during the year, and each time he was told, in effect, that he could still leave. And at the end of the year, if he still wanted to, he made his profession in the chapter house before the whole community, wrote out the document of his vows in his own hand if he could write, laid it on the altar himself, and then prostrated himself before each member of the house in turn while they sang. And from that moment he had no property, no separate future, no freedom of movement, no choice about how any hour of any day was to be spent, and no way out. It is worth saying plainly how total that was. Not a job, not even a marriage, a permanent, legally binding transfer of an entire life into a building. Now the lay brothers, who I promised you, and who are the group most often left out of the picture entirely. When the white monks set out in the 12th century to live from their own land rather than from tenants' rents, they ran straight into a contradiction. The rule demands both a full round of 8 offices a day and real manual labor. And if you are farming several thousand acres in a northern valley, there are simply not enough hours in the day for a man to do both properly. Their solution was to create a second parallel category of member. The lay brothers, the conversi, were full members of the house who took vows and lived under obedience and were buried in its ground, but who were not choir monks. They did not learn Latin. They did not sing the office. They were, in most houses, not taught to read, and in some the statutes explicitly forbade teaching them, on the grounds that literacy would draw them away from the work, a decision which looks colder the longer you look at it. Instead of the 8 sung offices, they said a fixed number of simple prayers, learned by heart, which they could recite anywhere, in a field, in a barn, walking behind a plow. And in exchange, they did the work. They had their own quarters, generally the entire west range of the cloister, with their own dormitory above and their own refectory below, and their own door into the western end of the church, which was separated from the monks' choir by a screen so that the two communities could worship in the same building without mixing. They had a longer sleep and a shorter office and more food because they needed it. They wore the same undyed wool, but a shorter, more practical version of it, and they kept their beards, which is why the older sources call them the bearded brothers, and which meant that in a house where everyone was shaven, you could tell at a glance which world a man belonged to. They were, in many of the northern houses, far more numerous than the monks. There are well-documented English abbeys where a community of perhaps 80 choir monks was supported by 500 lay brothers. And at that ratio, it is fair to say the abbey was, socially speaking, a large farming corporation with a chapel attached, run for and by the men in the fields. Where were they? Mostly not in the abbey at all. The white monks organized their estates into granges, which were self-contained farms, each a compact group of buildings, a great barn, a byre, a dormitory, a chapel, a kitchen, all within a wall, placed a few miles apart across the abbey's land, and worked by a resident group of lay brothers under one of their number appointed as master. The rule was that a grange should be no more than a day's journey from the mother house, so that the men could come in for the great feasts and be visited. Some of these granges survive as farmhouses with impossibly grand medieval barns behind them, and the barns are worth going out of your way for, because a monastic tithe barn is one of the great buildings of England. Enormous timber roofs, aisled like a church, built to hold the entire grain harvest of a huge estate, with doors big enough to bring a loaded wagon straight in so that it could be threshed under cover in winter. The floor of a barn like that, when the flails are going, produces a sound like slow applause that carries half a mile. And what did the granges produce? In the north and in the uplands, above all, wool. This is the point where the monastery stops being a spiritual story and becomes an economic one, and there is no honest way to tell the tale without it. English wool in the 13th and 14th centuries was the finest raw material in Europe, and the weavers of Flanders and Italy would pay almost anything for it. And the great northern abbeys with their thousands of upland acres were among the largest producers in the kingdom. Italian merchant houses sent agents to English abbeys to negotiate for the clip years in advance. There are surviving lists compiled by these merchants which grade the wool of each named monastery by quality and quantity, like a wine list. And the abbots knew exactly where they stood on it. The money that came back built the churches. Every soaring arcade and every acre of glass in the great northern houses was, in a very direct sense, paid for by fleece. And as with every commodity boom in history, some houses got their arithmetic wrong. Selling the clip years ahead is a loan against the future, and when a bad season came, or a disease ran through the flocks, the Abbey still owed the wool it had already been paid for, and the debts of some famous English houses in the later 13th century were spectacular enough to require royal intervention. Beyond wool there was everything else a great estate does. Grain sold into towns, cattle, horses bred for sale, quarries, lead mines in the northern dales, and iron, and salt pans on the coast where seawater was boiled down in lead pans over peat fires, tanneries, fulling mills, where woven cloth was pounded by water-driven hammers in a mixture of water and fuller's earth to thicken it, an early piece of industrial mechanization that monastic houses adopted with enthusiasm. Boats, town property, because abbeys bought houses and shops in nearby towns as investments and collected the rents. Markets and fairs held under royal charter on the abbey's ground, taxed by the abbey, policed by the abbey's court. And it was all recorded in an unbroken flow of parchment by clerks in a hand that was designed for speed rather than beauty, and rolled up and tied and stored, and a good deal of it survives. And that is why we know how many eels came out of a particular pond in a particular year 700 years ago. All of that needed managing. And so a great abbey developed a department structure that would be entirely legible to anyone who has ever worked in a large organization. The men who held these posts were called obedientiaries, and each had a title, a defined responsibility, and, crucially, his own income from named estates, which is where a good deal of the later trouble came from. Since a system in which 15 officers each control their own revenues is a system in which nobody quite knows the total. There was the abbot, who, by the later Middle Ages, had usually moved out of the dormitory into his own lodging with his own hall and kitchen and guest chambers, because he was expected to entertain at a level the cloister could not host, and who spent a large part of the year traveling between manors, attending the king's councils, and defending the house's rights in court. Under him the prior ran the internal life of the house day to day, with a sub-prior beneath him, and the prior is the man who actually knew what was going on. The sacrist kept the church, the vessels, the vestments, the lights, and, importantly, the clock and the bells, and had a workshop and a fund for repairs. The precentor ran the singing and the books. The cellarer ran supply. The kitchener ran the kitchen. The refector the dining hall and its linen. The chamberlain the clothing and the laundry and the bathhouse, because there was one, and the customaries specify how often it was used, which was more often than the popular imagination allows and less often than we would now like. The infirmary ran the sick. The almoner ran charity. The hosteler ran the guests. The novice master ran the young. The pittancer ran the extras. The bursar or treasurer in the later centuries was brought in over the top of all of them to make the accounts add up, which was the reform that every visitation report in England kept recommending. Guests are worth their own moment, because hospitality was not optional. The rule states flatly that all guests are to be received as though they were Christ himself, and it means it, and the great abbeys took it seriously enough to build entire ranges for the purpose. A large house had a guest hall, or 2 or 3, graded by the rank of the visitor, from a fine chamber with a fireplace and a bed with hangings for a bishop or a great lord, to a plain hall with mattresses on the floor for pilgrims and ordinary travelers. There were stables to match. There was a guest kitchen, since guests ate meat and the community, in theory, did not. And the traffic was constant, because in a country with no other reliable accommodation, an abbey was the only certain bet on many roads. Royal parties descended on abbeys and ate through their winter stores in a fortnight, and there are letters from abbots to the crown that are masterpieces of respectful pleading. Merchants stayed. Pilgrims stayed, in numbers if the house held a notable relic. Scholars stayed. And so did an entire class of paying guests called Corodians, who had bought a place in the abbey for life, either with money or by giving it land, in exchange for a defined daily allowance of bread and ale and dishes, a chamber, firewood, and a servant, set down in a written contract so precise that it names the Louvres. It was, in effect, a retirement annuity, and by the 15th century a good many houses had sold rather too many of them, and were feeding a small population of elderly laymen who showed a marked reluctance to die on schedule. And at the gate, every day, the almoner gave out food. The scale of monastic charity has been argued over for a century by historians, and the honest position is somewhere in the middle of the argument. It was not the vast welfare system of romantic tradition, and the proportion of a great abbey's income spent on the poor was often small, in the low single figures. But it was daily, and it was reliable, and in a bad winter it was the difference between one outcome and another for the people at the gate. The almoner distributed the coarse loaves and the leavings of the community's table, the broken meats from the refectory, and cash doles on the anniversaries of benefactors who had endowed exactly that. Many houses kept an almonery building outside the gate. Some ran a small school there for a handful of poor boys, and some maintained a hospital down the road. Beyond the almonery, the abbey's relationship with the countryside around it was more complicated than either its admirers or its critics liked. It was the largest employer for miles. It was the landlord, and landlords are never universally loved, and the abbey's manorial court fined its tenants for the same offenses any other lord's court did. Its mill monopoly irritated people. Its claims over commons and pasture produced disputes that ran for generations, and in a few famous cases produced riots, in which townsmen who felt the abbey had too much control of their market came over the wall in numbers, and at the same time the same abbey buried those people's parents, took in their sons, lent them grain in a bad spring, and rang the bell that told them what hour it was. Both things are true, and it is the sort of relationship you find between any small town and the enormous institution it grew up around, in any century, anywhere. Let us put the whole year together now, slowly, and walk one turn of it, because the year is really the unit that a monastic life was measured in, decade after decade, until they ran out. In the deep of winter, the house is at its most inward. The nights are long, so the gap between the night office and daybreak is long, and the cloister is bitter, and the warming house fire is lit, and the community goes to it in shifts. There is one meal a day. The days are spent in reading and in the endless small maintenance of a large building in bad weather. And out in the fields there is threshing and hedging and the carting of wood and stone while the ground is hard enough to bear a cart. Christmas comes with its long night office and the best food of the year and, in many houses, a general relaxation that the stricter visitors disapproved of. Then Lent arrives and everything tightens. The single meal moves to the evening. The extras stop. Each brother receives his book. The church is stripped of color and a great veil is hung across the choir so that for weeks the community sings without being able to see the altar, which is a piece of theater so effective that it still works on people who have no idea why. Easter breaks it open again in the middle of the night with light and noise and the best singing of the year. And the whole community, which has been eating saltfish for 6 weeks, sits down to something else. Spring is lambing and plowing and sowing, and the granges are busy, and the Abbey's carts are on the road. The summer horarium comes in, the rising is earlier, the working day is longer, there are 2 meals, and there is a rest after the midday one. The fish ponds are netted. The building work resumes, because you cannot lay lime mortar and frost, so every masonry campaign in England ran from spring to autumn and stopped, and the tops of unfinished walls were thatched over for the winter. High summer is hay, and then harvest, which is the point at which every rule in every rule book bends, because the grain has to come in during a narrow window, and no institution has ever argued with that. Even in the strict houses, the offices were shortened or said in the field during harvest weeks. Then the corn comes into the great barns, and the sheep are shorn earlier in the summer, and the wool is packed and weighed and taken away by merchants who have already paid for it, and the malting starts again in earnest as the new barley comes in. Michaelmas, at the end of September, is the great accounting point of the English year, when rents fall due and stewards render their accounts and the whole estate reckons up. The winter horarium comes back, the nights lengthen, the fire is lit in the warming house again, and the bell rings at 2 in the morning, and the men come down the stair in the dark, exactly as they did last year, and the year before, and the century before. A man who entered at 17 and died at 72 lived that circle 55 times, 55 Lents, 55 harvests. Something over 20,000 nights of going down that staircase. Perhaps 160,000 individual offices sung. The same words, in the same order, in the same building, with the seasons sliding over the top of it. It is very nearly incomprehensible from the outside, and it is worth trying to hold in your mind for a moment before it goes, because there has never been anything else in English life quite like it, and there never will be again. It did not last, of course. Nothing does. From the 14th century onward, the pressure came from several directions at once. The great pestilence of the middle of that century cut the population of the country by something close to a half, and it went through the monasteries harder than most places, because a monastery is a group of men who sleep in one room, eat in one room, and sing shoulder to shoulder twice a night. Some houses lost their whole community and were refounded with strangers. The labor shortage that followed broke the economics of direct farming, and the granges were leased out to tenants, and the lay brothers, whose entire purpose had been that direct farming, dwindled away over about a century until the West Ranges stood half empty and were converted to other uses. Recruitment never recovered to its old level. Numbers in the great houses fell to a half or a third of their peak, and the buildings, designed for the peak, began to feel large. The estates still produced, and in strictly financial terms, many houses were comfortable to the very end, but the shape had changed. A house built for 100 singers now had 30, with better rooms, more meat, more servants, more paperwork, and a good deal less of the original idea. Reformers said so at the time, loudly, and then, in the 1530s, in the space of about 4 years, all of it stopped. Every religious house in England and Wales was closed by act of the Crown, the communities pensioned off or dispersed, the movable wealth taken, the estates sold to the gentry. The lead stripped from the roofs and melted on sight in fires made from the choir stalls, the glass knocked out, the bells taken down and broken up for the metal, and the stone left as an open quarry for the neighborhood, which used it to build farmhouses and field walls and barns, some of which are standing today with a carved medieval capital sitting quietly in the middle of a course of. Ordinary rubble. The men themselves mostly went quietly. The heads of houses were given generous pensions and, in a few cases, bishoprics. The ordinary brothers received small annual sums, enough to live on modestly if they were careful, and many of them became parish clergy, and the pension lists were still being paid out to a dwindling handful of very old men more than 40 years later. Which means that somewhere in the 1580s there were elderly Englishmen who had woken at 2 a.m. to sing in a building that no longer had a roof. The lay servants were simply dismissed, in numbers all at once, in a countryside that had no other work for them, and that dislocation is one of the least discussed social consequences of the whole business. The books went in every direction. Some were saved by collectors who understood exactly what was being lost and rode round the country buying them out of stables and shops. Some were sold abroad by the cartload. A great many were cut up for practical purposes, because parchment is tough and useful, and for the next century English bookbinders lined their covers with pages of medieval manuscript. And grocers wrapped goods in them, and there is a well-known complaint from the period about a merchant who had bought enough of them to keep him supplied for years. Which is why, even now, a conservator taking apart an old binding will occasionally find a fragment of a 13th century chant book folded inside it, with the notation still perfectly legible. Still telling somebody how to sing something. What is left is what you can go and stand in. Roofless walls and mown grass beside a river, a church without a roof, its great east window an empty stone shape full of sky. The stumps of the cloister arcade. The solarium, which often survives best because it was vaulted in stone rather than roofed in timber, so that in some houses you can still walk the whole length of a low undercroft on the original floor and see the springing of the vaults exactly as the cellarer saw them. The night stair worn into hollows, the drain still running. The fish ponds reduced to shallow rectangular depressions in a field, holding a little water after rain, which is how most of them appear on an aerial photograph on a wet spring morning, a set of pale outlines under the grass like the marks a heavy piece of furniture leaves in a carpet, and the great barns most of all, which survived because a barn is useful and a church is not, and which are still standing in working farmyards with tractors in them. The names came through as well into the ordinary map, which is where the whole thing is hiding in plain sight. Every Abbey Road and Abbott's Bromley and Monkton and Monk's Risborough and Grange Farm and Priory Lane, every field on an old tithe map called Chapel Close or Sellfield or Freighter Piece. Every parish boundary that runs in an odd loop for no reason anybody can now explain, except that it followed the edge of a grange 800 years ago. Every road in England that goes the long way round a low hill because the hill was once monastic pasture. Every apple variety kept alive in a hedgerow that started in an abbey orchard. It is all still out there, mixed into the landscape like sugar and water, and the people who live on top of it mostly have no idea, and there is no reason at all why they should. And the round of hours itself, the thing all of it was built to support, did not stop either, though it moved. It moved into cathedral choirs, which kept singing morning and evening prayer daily and are still doing it tonight in a couple of dozen English towns, to a handful of listeners and an empty nave, using words hammered into shape by men who have been dead for 1,000 years. It moved into new communities, founded later, keeping the old timetable in new buildings. It moved into recordings, which is a strange afterlife for a sound designed never to be heard by anybody outside the room. And it moved in a diluted and completely secular form into the simple human discovery that a fixed daily order, the same actions in the same sequence at the same times, is one of the very few reliable defenses against the disorder of being alive. The monks did not invent that idea, but they tested it harder and for longer than anyone else in European history, thousands of men across 1,000 years, and their conclusion was that it works, and that the price is your freedom, and that a surprising number of people will consider that a reasonable exchange. So there it is. A valley in the north of England with a river in it and grass and some walls. Somewhere under that grass is a lead pipe that still falls at the correct gradient. Somewhere under that grass are several hundred men in rows with no stones over them, who between them got up in the middle of the night about 6 million times. The bell that woke them was broken up for its metal and went into cannon or into another bell somewhere else and is still ringing in some form in a tower that has no idea what it used to be. Long after the last of them was buried, the water kept moving through the drain, and it is moving through it tonight, quietly, under the grass, doing what it was built to do for a house that is not there. None of it needs anything from you. It will go on doing that whether you remember any of tonight or not. Which brings us to the end. Are you still awake? If you are, there is another video waiting for you on the screen, and it will start on its own in a moment, and it is exactly the same kind of thing as this one, so there is no need to decide anything or to press anything at all. If tonight helped, you might leave a like or subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and honestly, the best moment to do that is tomorrow, in the daylight, once you have slept properly. And do leave your location and your local time down in the comments below if you feel like it. Someone lying awake at 4 a.m. on the other side of the world will read it and feel a little less alone, which is a small thing that costs nothing and works surprisingly well. Now let the Abbey go. Let the valley go. Let the bell go quiet in the tower, and let the frost stay on the grass. Let your shoulders come down one more time. Let your jaw unclench, and your hands open, and the whole long day you have had slide off the edge of the bed and onto the floor where it can wait until morning. You do not need to remember any of this. There is nothing to keep hold of, and nothing you have missed, and nothing that needs you tonight. Close your eyes. Good night and sweet dreams.